Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our lecture today on combined vision and hearing loss, or dual sensory loss and deaf-blindness. My name is Walter Wittich. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Optometry at the University of Montreal, and I get to give the first part of today's lecture. Now, we actually decided some time ago to do a study that relates directly to the relevance of why we would want to teach you about dual sensory loss in the context of studying occupational or physical therapy. And so together with Aliki Thomas, we decided to do a survey of the members of the occupational therapy order in Quebec, and we asked people questions about their training in terms of sensory impairment and also their work experience in this context in order to get a better idea of how often people actually interact with somebody that has a sensory loss, given that this is not necessarily a central theme of the kind of training that you're receiving right now. It turns out if you look, for example, at vision impairment, and any kind of training that relates to visual impairment, the large majority of students in occupational therapy will have learned about the eye, about how vision works, even about visual impairment, and about how vision affects occupational performance. But then when you look a little deeper at questions that relate to vision rehabilitation or actually gaining hands-on experience in this context, the majority of the students actually do not learn anything about this. This is really interesting when you then compare that to the fact that almost everybody that answered our survey in this case actually reported that they currently see clients that are living with a vision impairment. So this makes really sensory training much more obvious. We decided that we would pose the same questions in the context of dual sensory impairment, and it turns out here the picture is very different. The large majority of the occupational therapists that responded to our survey tell us that they never learned anything about dual sensory loss, its effect on performance, on rehabilitation options. There were no clinical placements or assignments. There were no guest lectures. But more than half do have clients that are living with combined vision and hearing loss. So this is something that was really missing at the time in the context of the curriculum, and that is in part one of the reasons why we're here today, because this lecture today was created in response to this study. So what I'm going to do today is start you out with a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of context, in order to get you ready for the case study that will be part of the lecture later on. So I will first talk a little bit about how we actually measure visual function, auditory function. How do we measure our senses? What kind of information might you come across if you are looking at a patient file, for example? We're going to look a little bit at causes for dual sensory loss and which kind of age groups might be most likely affected by which kind of impairment. And then at the very end, I want to tie this together and talk a little bit about how this is relevant specifically in the rehabilitation context for communicating with your clients, for adapting your service delivery, and things to consider specifically in the context of providing assistive technology and training and strategies for these kinds of technologies. So let's start with how we actually measure the senses. Many of you have probably had an eye exam at some point. There are a couple of different ways of how eligibility for rehabilitation services is determined. It is usually defined with the visual ability in the better eye, with the best standard optical correction, so with normal glasses that are less than 4 diopters. And so with this kind of refraction, if somebody has acuity that is less than 20/70 or around 20/60 for persons that have a progressive degenerative disease, such as macular degeneration, then you would be able to access rehabilitation services, specifically if there is some kind of perceived impairment that we can address. In terms of visual field, like I mentioned earlier, 60 degrees is sort of the magic number, and the only exception to this is people that have a half field loss or a hemianopia, which is at times the result of a stroke, for example, to the visual cortex. There are questionnaire screening methods that you can use in order to identify people living with a visual impairment. Here, for example, is the English version of the visual impairment screening questionnaire that is currently used within the Montreal Rehabilitation system. Because if you have a score of 6 or higher on this questionnaire, you are likely eligible for rehabilitation. So this is something that people can incorporate into their clinical assessments before they actually see a client in order to get a better idea of their current visual abilities. Switching over to hearing, the measure that you're most likely going to see in the clinical context is the audiogram. For those of you who have never seen an audiogram, the way it is structured is that on the x-axis you will measure the frequency, so the pitch of a sound from low to high, very much as we would see on a piano. And on the y-axis you have its loudness or its strength of the sound in decibels. In this case here you will see that this is graded in decibel hearing loss. We'll get to that in a moment. And as we are going downwards on the y-axis, the impairment gets stronger, or the threshold of whatever you can hear is a louder noise. So if we now actually plot various sounds that you might be familiar with into the audiogram space, you will see that there's sort of a zone here that has roughly the shape of a banana. It is called the speech banana, and that is the component of the audiogram that indicates the connection of audibility for speech sounds. So the moment these areas are not audible anymore, you will have a functional effect in terms of speech. So how do you read the audiogram? You can tell that very fine noises would be up here, where at the decibel level we would have 0. So interpretation of an audiogram here is if you have a 0 decibel hearing loss, this would indicate that you have no loss, no impairment. You can actually have a negative number here, and these are people that have better than normal hearing. As you go downwards, you can see that things get louder. This here would be a jet plane. You can see that a gunshot would fall into the category of extremely loud. And so that gives you a better idea of what kind of sounds are audible at which type of frequency. When you then look at an audiogram that is measured by an audiologist, you will usually get 2 lines on there. The red one with the round targets is the right ear. So that's kind of easy to remember. The blue crosses therefore are for the left ear. And here you see somebody who has sort of a mild hearing loss in both ears at the lower frequencies, but then at the middle to higher frequencies there is a drop-off. And this is a very, very typical audiogram that you would see in an older adult who simply has age-related hearing loss, or as you will learn later on, this is called presbycusis. The way audiograms are indicated and measured is that you would perform a pure tone audiometry, meaning you present pure tones at each of these frequencies, and you test whether or not people can hear these sounds. This will then give you a pure tone average, indicating the decibel hearing loss. And in the Quebec context, for example, this is often done at the frequencies of 500, 1000, 2000, and 4000 hertz. These are then averaged, and the resulting number will give you your decibel hearing loss. Specifically, if you have an average of 26 decibels or higher for an older person, that would be an indicator of a level where it may threaten speech perception, and you may benefit from a hearing aid. You can tell in this graph that this progressive hearing loss at the higher frequencies is actually expected. Presbycusis is not necessarily something we can avoid very well, so we are expecting that especially at the higher frequencies people will have age-normal presbycusis or age-normal hearing loss. You will see that this applies to the lower frequencies as well, but this does not necessarily interfere with speech perception. Now, eligibility for hearing rehabilitation usually is based at a value of 35 decibel or higher. But it turns out that there are specific subcategories. So if you're under the age of 12 and hearing loss may threaten the development of language, you are eligible for all services and devices independent of the actual decibel threat. Similar, the threshold is lower to 25 decibel if you are school age or attending school, if you are in an employment situation and your employability may be threatened by the hearing loss, or interestingly, if you can demonstrate a functional limitation, specifically in the context of school, work, or society in general, you will be eligible for certain services, not necessarily for all devices. There's also an online questionnaire that people can complete in order to screen themselves for their hearing impairment. And I've also added below a PDF web link because this is a questionnaire that is developed in Montreal by the Institut Roman. It exists in French online as well, so it's a very handy tool to identify people that will self-report some kind of level of hearing loss. As far as I know, and I've been studying dual sensory loss for some time now, there's only one single measure that exists that actually measures the functional impairment of vision and hearing together. As part of the Inter-RAI Community Health Assessment, or the Inter-RAI CHA, there is a supplement called the Inter-RAI Deafblind Supplement that has several questions that identify functional loss based on combined hearing and vision loss. And so, for example, it is divided into domains such as communication, whether people actually are using sign language or tactile methods for communication, and which kind of services they are utilization that are specific to dual sensory loss, whether these are interveners, these are service providers to support independence in Ontario, or interpreters that are using sign language, or any kind of other rehabilitation service that is specifically tailored to combined vision and hearing loss. There are programs for rehabilitation in Quebec that are specifically tailored to a clientele that has combined vision and hearing impairment, and there are eligibility criteria that were created for this. Now, it turns out what you see here on the x-axis is an increase in the decibel hearing loss average for hearing, and an increase as you go up in the level of visual impairment. And so if you fall further to the upper right, you would automatically be eligible for devices or services. This depends a little bit. There's a gray zone around here. As I mentioned earlier, some of these eligibility criteria are very much based on the need of the client. But rehabilitation programs like this that are specifically designed for dual sensory loss are relatively rare. In this case, we're very lucky that we have a system in Quebec that will consider both senses together. And these are provided in Montreal, for example, as a collaboration between the CIUS Centre Sud, where the Institut Roman is located, the CIS Montérégie Centre, which is where the Institut Nazareth Louis Braille is located, and the Lethbridge Leighton Mackay Rehabilitation Center at the CIUS Centre West. Now you will see that I have shown you measures that are objective or behavior-based, and some measures that are subjective and really respond to what the person is telling you. And the reason I have done this is because there are some interesting data that have come out of the Canadian longitudinal study on aging, where I wanted to show you how these things hang or don't hang together. So here, for example, if we only look at vision, you will see that we have a logmar measure of vision, which is a statistical transformation whereby 0 would indicate normal vision at 20/20, 1 would be the limit for legal blindness, and so you can see here that we have an orange line which sort of indicates mild visual impairment. Here we've got a blue line that's a little further up that would indicate moderate visual impairment, and we've got that split across 4 different age groups. So if we now compare people's visual acuities on the y-axis as compared to their subjective report to the question, is your eyesight using glasses or corrective lenses? If you use them, excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor or non-existent, you will see immediately that there are some people that are reporting that their acuities are fair or poor. However, on their acuity measure, they actually are doing quite well. On the flip side to this, there are people who will tell you that their vision is excellent, very good, or good. However, when we measure their acuity, they actually fall above the moderate line. So these would be people with at least moderate visual impairment. So these two measures do not hang together very well. if you calculate a correlation, it is around 0.3. So the personal experience and the objective evaluation really tap into separate things. And it is important when you're dealing with a client that you actually ask both of these items, that you have an objective measure and that you compare that with a subjective measure to see what their level of functioning may actually be. In that same data set, we have, for example, here the proportion of older adults or age 45 to 85 that objectively measured with acuities and audiograms have dual sensory loss. And so if we look at these with only objective measures, you can see how that number increases all the way into the 80s, with about 25% over 80 having combined vision and hearing impairment. But here you have an indicator of the number of people that actually self-report this impairment. And so something very interesting happens. We have this exponential increase with age if we're looking at acuity and pure tone average, but a relatively flatlining linear increase when we look at the self-reported impairment of this dual sensory loss. So now under the age of 60, it kind of turns out that these behavioral measures underestimate the perceived impairment. And I put this in quotations because who am I to decide which one is the gold standard here? And on the other side, if you look at people over 60, the behavioral measures overestimate this perceived impairment. But which one of these is true very much may actually depend on your perspective and what it is you're trying to accomplish within your rehabilitation intervention. If you look at people with specific dual impairment in this context here, there are actually very few people that are truly deaf and blind. So what I call the Helen Kellers of the world. That number is relatively small when you look at the general population of persons with dual sensory impairment. It also turns out that you may have people in this group that actually show up with normal visual acuity and various levels of hearing loss. Just to remind you, you may actually be defined as deaf-blind based on your visual field, not on your visual acuity alone. And so these people inside the green circle are actually individuals that have Usher syndrome, which is a condition where you have a reduced visual field that comes together with a progressive hearing loss. And then you've got this blob here in the middle. These are actually mostly older adults that have a partial visual impairment and a partial hearing impairment. In this case, actually, we're looking at the parents of the baby boomers. And so these people are very interesting as a clientele because they are actually quite rehabilitatable because they have residual vision and hearing function. So if you now look at this idea that you can have deafblindness at different times in life and for different causes, you have a group of people that are simply born with both hearing and visual impairment. And so these are congenital. And then you've got the acquired gang. And so now it can be that the hearing was congenital, but the vision was acquired. The vision was congenital and the hearing was acquired, or that both the vision and the hearing impairment were acquired later in life. Another way of dividing this group is that there is neither vision or residual hearing. So these would be the Helen Kellers I mentioned earlier. It could be that people are blind with residual vision, blind with residual hearing, or deaf with residual vision, or it could be, like I pointed out, the older gang that has residual vision and hearing, and that, as it turns out, is actually the largest proportion of people that you will encounter in the context of combined vision and hearing loss. What is probably my favorite definition of deafblindness, it comes from the American Association of the Deafblind. And it says that deafblindness is a combination of hearing and vision loss of any varying degrees that affects a person's ability to communicate, get information, access community resources, employment, and independence. So it is the reason why I like this definition so much is because it is close to this idea of occupational performance, that you actually are not so much tied to whatever the acuities and visual fields are, or what the audiogram may say, but that we're really looking at the effect that this kind of sensory change or loss has on the person themselves. So what are the things that cause dual sensory loss? There was a very interesting study a little while ago that pooled data across 11 countries in Europe and looked at individuals over the age of 50, where around 10% have visual difficulties. Most of these people are living with age-related macular degeneration, which is likely the most prevalent vision impairment that is related to age. 13.5% reported hearing difficulties, and most of these people have presbycusis, which is age-related sensory loss, hearing loss in this case. But then you've got another 6% on top of this that have both macular degeneration and presbycusis. And now if you add all of this together, that gives you an idea that 1 in 3 people over the age of 50 will not hear and or see everything that you see. That is super relevant for any kind of clinical service delivery, and it must be considered because all healthcare professionals are now more likely than ever to actually encounter older adults with some kind of sensory impairment. We did a drug review in Montreal some time ago where we looked at all active files at the time. This was done in 2010, and to get a bit of a profile of the people that are receiving rehabilitation services in the Montreal region. And so it is very fascinating that, of course, the large majority of them are over the age of 80. In this case, these are the parents of the baby boomers. 2010 was the first year that the baby boomers would reach retirement age. And you will see the large majority, of course, being female for 2 main reasons. One is that the ladies are more likely to live longer, and they are also more likely to seek help, which is, of course, what you need to do in order to be in a rehabilitation program. I also found it very interesting that when you look at the younger cohorts here, often the males outnumber the females, and that has to do with some of the syndromes that cause combined vision and hearing loss early in life, because many of them are X-linked and therefore more likely to show up in boys than they do in girls. We published a book chapter a while ago where we have a more in-depth look at these early causes in life, and so you will see that there are various syndromes and impairments that are genetically based that cause both an impairment in vision and in hearing. You can tell already that the largest number here are the different types of Usher syndrome, and you will find things that you may only encounter in your life once or twice. Looking here at Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome, a degenerative neural condition that is basically reducing sensory input from the periphery to the central system over the entire lifespan. Some of these things you will literally only come across once, and it's difficult to prepare for any one of these syndromes in a specific way. Sometimes you simply have to look them up as they come along. Rubella used to be a much bigger deal, more so than it is now, but you will potentially find older adults in the system that are deafblind due to rubella. And then, of course, there are sometimes unanticipated things such as stroke, for example, or encephalitis that can hit you later in life, or various tumors that may also cause combined vision and or hearing loss. When we tied all of this together, you can see how the diagnostics are distributed. In the Montreal region here, the percentage of Usher syndrome is higher than we would usually would expect in North America, elsewhere, or in Europe. That has to do a little bit with the founder effect in Quebec, whereby this percentage is quite high in the Francophone community. And since linguistically this community to this day remains a little bit more isolated, there are family trees that have maintained the Usher syndrome in the Francophone community. I found it very interesting that roughly a third of this population that is being treated right now are individuals that are only identified by 2 diagnostics: age-related macular degeneration and presbycusis. And then you've got another chunk here of other age-related vision impairments that are not AMD, such as diabetic retinopathy or glaucoma, together with presbycusis. So just half of these diagnoses are age-related impairments. A large chunk of this population are older adults. So, why is this relevant, and why would you want to know about this? There are a couple of tips that I just want to plant in your lives because this is probably going to be a useful way of going about planning your sessions, about planning an intervention with anybody who has suspected vision and or hearing loss. First of all, you have a new client. Look in the file whether you can find any kind of sensory information or chart information or anything on the referral that actually may give you an idea. If you have time, these people may be able to complete a screening questionnaire for you before you are even seeing them, or simply ask them when they're there. Most people will be relatively open about this in a rehabilitation context if there is a sensory impairment. However, they may not always be aware. So this is not necessarily something that people will always be able to report. I showed you earlier that the objective and subjective experience does not always agree. Things to consider specifically in the context of vision. If you provide services face-to-face, avoid glare behind you. It is going to be important for people to be able to see your face, to see your lips, to see your facial expression, to be able to read your body language. In order to do this, you don't want any kind of shadow falling on your face. You don't want glare behind you. Don't sit in front of a window or a lamp, because it will make this type of information much more difficult to access. If you are providing providing information, make sure that you have a large print option. It could also be an electronic option if people prefer to get their documents by email. You can send things in Word format that is generally accessible, and you can email things even ahead of time if people would like to have access to information in written format. If it is not necessarily large print, maybe you can provide some kind of magnification. A simple handheld magnifier in your clinic may already do the trick for some things. We will talk about CCTVs in a moment, but this is never a bad idea. You may have seen this in shopping malls now, where there are magnifiers that are attached to the carts where people can read price tags. This may also apply to your clinical service delivery. Try to avoid any kind of clutter in your workspace. It is easier for people not to trip over things. It will also be easier for them to identify things that you place in front of them if they are placed on an empty space, so they can really focus on what it is they're looking at. And whenever you have an option to use a high contrast environment, having things black on white is going to be making life a lot easier. I wanted to give you an example here of an audiologist, for example, who uses a CCTV, which is a stand magnifier on a table that will allow you to project a larger image, in this case onto a television screen. What she's doing is she's demonstrating the pieces of the hearing aid on how to change the battery, and this way the person with the vision impairment can build a mental map of what the hearing aid actually looks like, what the switches may feel like, and so it can then reconstruct what they are supposed to be doing even when they may not be able to see every detail. When it comes to hearing, you want to generally avoid noise. This noise can be something simple as the air conditioner that you see you hear behind you. It could be something more intensive as in traffic outside. It all comes down to, can you create an environment that has as least distractions as possible? You do not want to start yelling. You simply need to speak clearly, sometimes a little bit more slowly. A trick that I have used in the past is you can use your interface with your computer by dictating to Word, and so the computer will transcribe. That is the same idea. When you speak too fast, the transcription gets muddy. It's a little bit like teaching. If I speak if I speak more slowly and clearly, you are more likely to understand what it is I'm saying. That same concept applies to persons with a hearing loss. This becomes a lot easier if you give them a context about what you're presenting before you start presenting it. So when you are talking about the functionality of a magnification device or about a mobility aid, then start out by saying, so about this mobility aid. So they now know that you're talking about this mobility aid, and they will be able to reconstruct your vocabulary more easily. If you need to make sure that they have actually understood and heard what it is you are presenting to them, ask them to repeat this information back to you. This is not a bad idea under best conditions even when hearing and vision are doing okay. This may also be a wonderful strategy when you're not entirely sure where the cognitive abilities of the person are, but specifically in the context of hearing, this is a very good idea. A few extra tips. Allow for more time. When interacting with people that have a vision and a hearing loss, their effort in order to comprehend what you are trying to do is going to be higher. So give them more time and do less in this time to make sure that you can actually be sure to have gotten through. If you have to test or assess some kind of ability or functionality, again, I'm thinking of cognition, try tests that are not timed, because it may simply take more time to accomplish something. This may not necessarily be a reflection of their cognitive ability. It may only be a measure of effort that it takes in a sensory impairment case. If you have the ability and the opportunity to engage care providers, now these may be informal care providers like family members, friends, neighbors, other people that are involved in the lives of these people, engage them in this process, because some of the repetition, some of the information, some of the reminding may need to be done by the people at home and around them. Finally, know your referral options. It is always going to be a very good professional network for you to know somebody that is specializing in vision, that is specializing in hearing, or there are some people like me that specialize in dual sensory loss. So know how and who to refer to, because your clients will indeed thank you for this. So, if you want to know a little bit more about that, some of my work is available through Twitter, but you can also find me on my website at the University of Montreal, or you can always email me. And if there are any other questions that you would still like to contact me for, I will gladly answer. And now I think you should be ready for the next piece, which is going to look at a little bit more of the practical application and context of dual sensory rehabilitation.